There's a hand that holds mine when people die. It's small, like a child's. The fingers are thin, and the palm is always cold. A deep, penetrating cold that sinks right through my glove. It's surprisingly strong. The real problem, is that it isn't there. You can't see it. No one can. But I feel it. And I felt it every time I've lost a patient for the last 3 years. You're probably thinking I'm crazy. Burnout. PTSD. Believe me, I've charted it all in my head. A somatic stress response. A tactile hallucination. I'm an ER nurse with 20 years on the floor. I believe in science, in observable phenomena, in the clear, hard line between life and death. But I was there the night that line was erased. I know what's real. And this is real. It began on a Tuesday, with a man who had no name. Tuesdays in the St. Michael's ER are a special kind of purgatory, the hangover from the weekend's chaos, colliding with the mundane misery of the work week. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and stale coffee, a symphony of hacking coughs, and the rhythmic, urgent beeping of a dozen monitors playing slightly out of key. I was halfway through a 14-hour shift, deep in that surreal state of exhaustion where the fluorescent light seemed to hum with a malevolent intelligence. "Sarah, got a present for you in Bay 4, Mark said, stripping off a pair of gloves with a weary snap. Mark's humor was as black as the coffee we drank. Hypothermic John Doe. Some kids found him out by the old Blackwood quarry. No wallet, no phone, just old clothes and a core temp in the low 90s. Lovely, I muttered, grabbing a fresh set of Vitals cuffs. Let's see what we're working with. The man in Bay 4 was a ghost before he was even dead. He lay on the gurney, a withered husk wrapped in silver emergency blankets, his skin the color of old parchment. He looked to be in his late 70s, maybe older, with a roadmap of wrinkles on a face that seemed to have given up on expression. His breathing was a shallow, rattling whisper. But it was the cold that was wrong. It wasn't the clinical chill of hypothermia I was used to. This was a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to leach the warmth out of the air around him. It felt ancient. We got to work. The practice dance of resuscitation. Dr. Evans, a resident barely old enough to rent a car, called out orders. Let's get a central line in, Push warmed Saline. I want a full talk screen. My hands moved with an autonomy born of repetition. I found a stubborn, thready vein in his arm, slid the IV in, and taped it down. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling of profound sorrow that radiated from him. It was more than just the pathos of an old man dying alone. It was a grief so heavy it felt like a physical pressure in the room. I glanced at the heart monitor. His rhythm was slow, unstable, a shaky, erratic baseline. The light above his bay flickered once, twice, then held steady. For the next few hours, he was our mystery. John Doe, Bay 4. He was stable, for a given value of the word. Comatose, but his temperature was slowly climbing. I found myself drawn to his bedside during lulls, checking his vitals more often than necessary. There was something about his stillness, the absolute vacancy in his face, that felt like a question I didn't know how to ask. The code alarm blared through the ER just after 3 a.m. It was him. Ventricular tachycardia. His heart was beating itself to death. He's coding, I yelled, hitting the button on the wall. The room exploded into controlled chaos. Dr. Evans was across the unit, intubating a victim from a house fire. It was me, Mark, and a couple of techs. Starting compressions. Mark grunted, climbing onto a stool and leaning over the old man. Pads are on. Charging to 200, quote. I said, my voice clipped, professional. My training took over, a series of commands and responses drilled into my nervous system. Clear! The man's body jerked on the gurney. The monitor screeched, the chaotic waveform persisting. No change. Still in VTACH. Pushing one of EPI. I leaned in, my left hand bracing against the bed rail for leverage as I checked for a pulse in his neck. The metal was cold under my nitrile glove. The air was thick with the smell of ozone from the defibrillator. It was in that moment, in that crucible of adrenaline and procedure, that it happened. I felt a hand slide into mine. My first thought, a flicker in the storm of the code, was that it was Dr. Evans arriving to take over, a gesture of support. But it wasn't a doctor's hand. It was small, impossibly small, like a child's, and it was cold. Not the ambient chill of the room, but a deep, cellular cold that seemed to sink right into my bones. It slipped into my palm, and its fingers, surprisingly strong, curled around my own. My breath hitched. I squeezed back on pure instinct. The grip tightened in response. It was real. Utterly, tangibly real. My professional mind scrambled for an explanation. A somatic hallucination. A nerve misfiring from exhaustion. My hand spasming. I risked a glance down. My gloved left hand was resting alone on the starched white bedsheet. There was nothing there. I stared, my mind refusing to reconcile the sight with the undeniable sensation of those small, cold fingers locked with mine. The world seemed to slow down. The frantic shouts of the ER faded into a distant roar. All I could feel was the weight of that unseen hand, a silent, desperate plea. The heart monitor suddenly changed its frantic tune. The jagged peaks of VTach collapsed into a single, unwavering, horizontal line. Asystole. He's flatlined, Dr. Evans said, finally at my side. He looked at the monitor, then at the patient. Time of death, 3:17. The moment the words were spoken, the pressure in my hand vanished. It didn't fade, it was just gone, as if a switch had been flipped. The sudden absence was as shocking as the presence had been. A wave of vertigo washed over me, and I gripped the bedrail with my now empty hand to steady myself. "You okay, Sarah?" Mark asked, his face flushed with exertion. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He meant it as a joke. That dark gallows humor that keeps us sane. I forced a laugh that sounded brittle and thin even to my own ears. "Just a long shift, Mark. Just a long, damn shift." But it wasn't the shift. As they wheeled the body away to the morgue, I stood in the now empty bay, the silence roaring in my ears. I could still feel the phantom impression of a child's hand in mine. Sleep offered no escape. I kept reliving those 30 seconds. The clinical emergency, the tactile reality of that grip, the blank space where a hand should have been. I'd wake up flexing my left hand, half expecting to feel that chilling pressure again. At work, I became jumpy. Every brush of a colleague's arm in a crowded trauma room, every time a patient reached for me, my heart would hammer against my ribs. I avoided Bay 4, like it was radioactive. Rationality is a nurse's shield. Without it, you're lost. I needed to rationalize this. I needed to find a mundane explanation for the impossible. And it all started with the John Doe. Who was he? Why was he at the quarry? The questions became an obsession, a frantic attempt to rebuild the wall inside my head. I started with his belongings. A small, clear plastic bag in the hospital safe. The charge nurse, Judy, owed me for covering her last Christmas, so she bent the rules and let me see it. The contents were meager. A single, antique-looking car key, pitted with rust, and a silver locket on a tarnished chain. It was smooth and worn, clearly held and worried over for a lifetime. My hand trembled slightly as I pressed the clasp. It sprang open. On one side, an empty, glassless frame. On the other, tucked behind a yellowed piece of plastic, was a sepia photograph of a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. He wasn't smiling. He wore a little collared shirt and stared at the camera with an unnerving, solemn gravity, as if he knew something the photographer didn't. That face. I knew I had to find his name. That night, my laptop screen cast a pale, ghostly light across my dark living room. I started with the city's digital newspaper archives. Search terms. Blackwood Quarry. Accident. Missing. It took less than an hour. An article from the Scranton Valley Chronicle, dated July 14, 1968. The headline read, "Local Boy Lost in Quarry Tragedy." My blood ran cold. I clicked the link. The story was brief, tragic. The Miller family had been on a picnic near the quarry's edge. Their 8-year-old son, Daniel, had wandered off. They heard a splash. A frantic search found nothing but a small shoe floating on the deep, murky water. His body was never recovered from the quarry's treacherous depths. The article included a photograph of the grieving father, Arthur Miller, his face a mask of hollowed-out despair. Next to him was a school portrait of his son, Daniel Miller. It was the boy from the locket. And the grieving father. It was my John Doe. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. Arthur Miller, nearly 60 years later, his mind likely clouded by age and dementia, had walked back to that place. He had returned to the site of his life's greatest wound, perhaps to finally find his son. And when his own life had ended on my gurney, in the sterile, indifferent environment of the ER, his son had been there, waiting. Daniel's ghost had reached out, not in anger, not to frighten, but for comfort, for connection. He was just a little boy, lost for 50 years, watching his father leave him for the second and final time. He had reached for the nearest comforting presence in the room. He had reached for me. A wave of immense, crushing sadness washed over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. It wasn't a horror story, it was a love story. A tragedy that had finally found its last, quiet chapter in my ER. I felt a sense of closure, of understanding. The mystery was solved. The experience, while terrifying, was contained. It belonged to Arthur and Daniel Miller. A sacred, ghostly secret I would carry, but one that was, I believed, over. I was wrong. The story wasn't over. It had only just found its narrator. A week passed, then two. The ER turned on, its relentless cycle of pain and relief unabated. The memory of the unseen hand began to soften, to feel more like a dream. A vivid, unsettling dream, but a dream nonetheless. I started to believe my rational mind was winning, patching up the cracks in my worldview. Then came another Tuesday night. The air was heavy and humid, promising a thunderstorm that wouldn't break. The ER was deceptively quiet. Too quiet. We all knew it wouldn't last. The call came over the radio. Multi-vehicle collision, I-81 northbound. 1 pediatric critical, ETA 5 minutes. The familiar cold dread settled in my stomach. Pediatric trauma is the worst. It's the one thing that can shake even the most hardened veterans. They brought her in on a backboard, a tiny thing, no older than 10. A mess of blood and torn clothing. Her name was Lily. Her mother sobbed in the waiting room. A drunk driver had crossed the median. She was fading fast. Her blood pressure was in the gutter, her pulse a thready whisper. We descended on her, a swarm of green scrubs and focused intent. No pulse. She's in PEA, Dr. Evans shouted. Sarah, start a line. We need to push fluids now. I leaned over the gurney, my hands moving with practiced speed. Her arm was small, fragile. I searched for a vein, my fingers probing gently. The world narrowed to that small patch of skin, the smell of iodine, the desperate race against the clock. Come on, sweetie, I whispered, more to myself than to her. Stay with us, just hang on. And then I felt it. It started in my free hand, the left one, which was resting on the edge of the gurney. A familiar, creeping cold. And then the pressure. The same, small, impossibly cold hand slipped into mine. This time, there was no shock, no confusion, only a wave of pure, ice-water terror. It wasn't a memory, it wasn't a hallucination, it was here. The grip was tighter than before, clinging with a desperate, lonely strength. My mind screamed, but my body didn't stop. My hands kept working, securing the IV, opening the line. The training, the 20 years of conditioning, it wouldn't let me freeze. But inside, my carefully constructed world had not just been breached. It had been utterly annihilated. I didn't look down. I knew what I would see. Nothing. The monitor beeped. A weak but steady rhythm returned. She was back. For now. We worked for another hour, stabilizing her before rushing her up to surgery. Through it all, the entire time, the unseen hand held mine. It only let go when they wheeled her gurney out of the trauma bay, its purpose served. I stumbled into the supply closet, my back sliding down the cool metal shelves until I was sitting on the floor. I stared at my left hand, turning it over and over under the dim light of the single bulb. It looked like my hand. It felt like my hand. But it wasn't mine anymore. It was an anchor. That was 3 years ago. I still work at St. Michael's. I still work the night shift in the ER. I am good at my job. But I am no longer just a nurse. I am a conduit. I am a lighthouse for a lonely little boy lost in the dark. Every time a patient begins to fade, every time we fight to pull a soul back from that precipice, I feel it. When an old woman's heart gives out, when a young man bleeds onto my floor, when a child takes its last, rattling breath. The small, cold hand of Daniel Miller finds mine. He holds on, a silent, spectral passenger on their journey. He isn't malevolent. I don't think he even knows what he's doing. He's just a child, drawn to the flickering warmth of life on the verge of being extinguished. He's drawn to me. My compassion, the very thing that made me a good nurse, has become my curse. I reach out to comfort the dying, and in doing so I call to him, and he always answers. The world of science and procedure is a thin veneer now. Beneath it, there is only the job, the living, the dying, and the unseen hand that holds mine in the space between. Sleep well tonight, if you can. Subscribe to Professional Nightmares for more stories from those who've seen what lurks in the shadows of everyday jobs. Your next nightmare is just one click away.